Hi everyone, and you are welcome to Private Access Modifier lecture. In this lecture, I'll start by a quick reminder about what an access modifier is, then we will see what private access modifier is, and how we can define a private attribute or a private method, and finally, I'll end up this lecture by a quick summary. So let's get started. Previously, we have defined what an access modifier is, and we see it's just a way to determine the scope within which we can access to an attribute or to a method. And we see also that we have three types of these access modifiers: public, protected, and private. So far, we are familiar with public and protected, and mainly in this lecture, we will talk about private access modifier. So, what's private access modifier? Simply, when we say that this method or this attribute is private, all what we mean that we can use it only within the class scope. I mean within the class methods only. From this, we can understand that private access modifier is the most restricted access modifier among the other types. Now let's see how we can define private attribute or a private method. First of all, we have to define a class. Simply, we say class name. And then we define the constructor, and within the constructor, as usual, we define the attributes. And as we see here, in order to define a private attribute, we have to add double underscore at the beginning of the attribute name. So in my example here, I have two private attributes, private attribute 1 and private attribute 2. And we do the same thing exactly when we want to define private methods. So as you see here, I have double underscore private method 1 and double underscore private method 2. Now, when I say an attribute or a method is private, I mentioned that we can't access to these out of the class scope. And this is imposed by the programming language. But also in Python, there is, let me say, a backdoor which allow you to access these methods and attributes out of the class scope. But this backdoor to solve another problem, please don't use it. We will talk about in details later on in the lecture of names smuggling. Now let's move to Jupyter Notebook in order to see some code examples to understand how we can define these private attributes and methods in action. Alright, now let's say an example about private access modifier. I'll use in this code session the same example that I have used before for both public and protected access modifiers, whereas I will make everything now private. So in this example, I have a parent class and I have a child class which inherits the parent class. And as you see here, I have instance attribute, instance method. Also here I have another instance method and another instance method. In the child class also, I have instance attribute and 3 instance methods. Now, in order to make the instance attribute or the instance method private, all what you have to do is just adding 2 underscore at the beginning of the name. So in this case, the attribute parent private attribute and the methods parent private methods both are private because we have here double underscore at the beginning. Whereas parent public method and get private attribute value both are public methods because there is no single underscore or double underscore. The same thing for the child. So in the child class, we have this attribute and these methods, and both are private because the name starts with double underscore, whereas access parent private attribute and access parent private method both are public methods. Alright, so the key point here is to define a private attribute or method. All what you have to do is just add double underscore. Now let's try to get a private attribute out of the class scope. And here we have two cases. The first one is the following. Let's say that I want to define an object from parent class. So I'll say parent equal to parent. Let me run this. And here let me say print parent dot, and let me take the name of the attribute from here and run. You will see here that I have an attribute error, and the error is that parent object has no attribute parent private attribute. But look, it's already defined here. So this gives me error because I'm trying to access this attribute out of the class scope, where inside the main scope. And for this reason, we got an error. Now let's try to define child object, and from this child I will call this method which is access parent private attribute. And let me put it here. Let me comment this part and run. And also here I got again an attribute error. Look here, this method which is access parent attribute value try to return the private attribute value of the parent. But as I mentioned before, when we say this attribute or method is private, we can't access this method unless we are inside the same class scope. So we can't access it from the children classes or from the main scope. And for this reason, in both cases, I got an error. Let's continue now, and let's try now to call a private method out of the class scope. So I'll take this from here, and now instead of trying to print the attribute value, I'll try to call this method, and this method is parent private method. Look here, if I take this method and put it here and run, again, I will get error because I can't access to a private method out of the class scope. And also if I try to get access to this method using the object of the child class like the following, look here, now we have a child. If I go to this child, you will see here that I have a method. It's named access parent private method. Within this method, I'm trying to call the private method of the parent. If I try to run this simple code, also, I'll get an attribute error because I can't access to this method unless I am inside the class scope. So how we deal with private method is exactly like how we deal with the private attributes. Both can't be accessed out of the class scope. So now if you ask me why I could need a private method or a private attribute and how to use them. Usually, when I have such private members, we use them within the class scope. Like here, for example, I have a method, it's named parent public method, and this method could call one of these private methods, or it could return the private attribute that I want. So, using any private members usually will be only inside the class itself, and usually we define it to support the internal class functionalities that we don't want to expose to the external user. And thank you. Now let's recap what we have learned in this lecture. Simply, in this lecture, we have talked about private access modifier, and we see that when we say that this method or this attribute is private, we mean that we can access it only within the class scope. Next, we've talked about how to define this in Python, and we see that all what we have to do is just add double underscore before the name of the method or double underscore before the name of the attribute. Now please, I need you to refer to the challenges available in the lecture resources in order to practice what you have learned so far. Thank you so much for your time, and if you are available, join me in the next lecture.